I wanted to speak in this lecture about a range of issues going on in the Australian economy, starting, as Jan said, with thinking about how we've gotten to where we are now, but also focusing in particular on some of the challenges that COVID-19 poses for economists and for Australian public policy more broadly. Needless to say, I'll be skating across a range of different areas. So very much look forward to the question and answer session, to engaging with you about the problems that you think we're facing. The Australian economy has, over the course of the last couple of centuries since white settlement, benefited from a lot of low-hanging fruit. We had the luck of striking gold in the mid-1900s, which saw Australia's population triple in the course of a decade, and Melbourne's population, where you are, increased by a factor of 7. We've seen the benefits to Australia of successive waves of migrants, particularly in the gold rush period, but then also in the post-war period, which not only increased our aggregate GDP because more people naturally boost the size of the pie, but also had positive spillovers. Migration's been an enormous success story for Australia. As economists like to say, migrants don't just bring a mouth to be fed, they bring 2 hands to build and a mind to inspire. And so it's not surprising that if you look across Australia's entrepreneurs, migrants have been overrepresented. We've also benefited from the low-hanging fruit of a big increase in human capital. Over the post-war decades, we've increased school attendance and university attendance to a point now where a majority of Australians finish school and start some form of tertiary studies. That's very unusual, and we're a much more productive nation for it. If you go back to the period where I was born, the early 1970s, finishing school was an elite sport. Only about a quarter or so of the population did so. And universities were attended by only about 1/10 of the cohort. So the expansion of universities has been very, very important to productivity. Rule of thumb, an additional year of education boosts earnings by about 10%. So if you go from finishing year 10 to finishing year 12, that's an extra 20% productivity. Do a 3-year undergraduate degree, that's another 30% productivity. And it's got positive spillovers as well. We've also benefited from, in some sense, the low-hanging fruit of reducing gender discrimination. Not to say that gender discrimination has gone from the labour market, but its significant reductions through the late 1960s and early 1970s equal pay decisions and the flow-through impacts of those have meant that we have begun drawing in the business sector and law and medicine on the talents of the full population rather than half the population. Needless to say, if you only draw on half the population, you're going to end up with only half the talent. So that's been a significant driver of productivity. And as Australia has increasingly realised that improved access to childcare is a productivity issue, we've gained significantly from that. And then the final piece of low-hanging fruit that we've picked over the last couple of centuries has been the recent mining boom, in which since the beginning of this century, increased urbanisation in China and India in particular led to a massive run-up in demand for our commodities. That's had a particular impact in Western Australia, where direct employment from mining is still relatively small as a share of the economy, but flow-through employment from mining is substantial. And that significant increase in commodity prices acted as a significant driver of productivity in Western Australia. All of this low-hanging fruit that we picked, the mining booms, the reduction in gender pay discrimination, the improvement in human capital, have in some sense meant that Australia has been a little too complacent about the sources of our growth. We've grown thanks to our luck rather than to the skill of our economic policymakers. One of the things I'm increasingly worried about in Australia is that we're not doing enough to invest in those sources of productivity growth. So well before COVID hit, I was giving speeches about the stagnant Australian economy. Now, as one economic policymaker recently quipped to me, Andrew, I'd take stagnant right now in a heartbeat. When you're going backwards and when you've got growth in the economy shrinking and unemployment rising, you wish for the halcyon days in which we simply weren't growing and unemployment was staying stable. But I still think that we need to raise our level of ambition. My concern in the pre-crisis period came from a number of metrics. First of all, we saw Australian living standards, real net national disposable income per capita, essentially flatlining. Australia was talking about the 30 years of uninterrupted economic growth, but we were missing the fact that much of that growth was coming through population. I said before that there's positive spillovers from immigration. That's certainly true. But those positive spillovers didn't seem to be enough to drive the economy in the first couple of decades of the 21st century. So we saw a situation in which we're patting ourselves on the back for a growing economy, but on a per-person basis, the economy really wasn't doing that well. And the increase in population size was masking deeper structural weaknesses. We had too, an increasing agglomeration in the economy, more and more firms merging, but fewer and fewer startups. Treasury has been tracking the rate of startups in Australia and has observed that when you strip out the non-employing firms, that is, people who've just got an ABN but are now essentially doing the same job, that Australia wasn't creating as many startups in recent years as it had at the beginning of the 21st century. Now, that's a real problem for an economy. We know that in order to be dynamic, economies need to be creating new firms. We said that even in the 1950s, you could tell that Detroit was one day going to be in trouble because it just had a handful of big car companies dominating the economy. So too, the Australian economy has for too long been living off a number of big firms. Here's a dinner party game you can play next time you're having dinner with a bunch of economists. Name more than 5 industries in Australia that are not dominated by a handful of big firms. It's much easier to find the industries that are dominated by big behemoths than it is to identify the industries in which there is plenty of competition. We think of banking and supermarket, telecommunications and airlines as being monopolised markets. But if it's also true in other sectors as well. If you look at the production of concrete or glass, if you look at beer or baby food, if you look at building societies, you see heavy market concentration in Australia. Now, market concentration doesn't invariably mean that there are firms exerting their market power, but it does give us a hint that something might be going wrong. We've seen too a fall in the share of national income going to workers. The labour share had long been thought to be one of these stable economic constants. But then since 1970, we've seen it trend downwards in Australia as it has in many other countries. That means that workers aren't getting their share of productivity gains. Of course, there's not a whole lot of productivity gains to go around. The Productivity Commission has documented over recent years a productivity slump in Australia that they date going back to somewhere around 2012 or 2013. They observe that What we used to once talk about as capital deepening has turned into capital shallowing. And there may be a link between the slow rate of productivity growth and that rise in big firms. If you're a monopolist, then there's not much incentive to do research and development. If someone comes along to challenge you, you can always just buy up their idea. You don't have to invest in R&D. The Australian government invests about as much in research and development as the typical advanced country. But our business sector invests much less. And there's very little collaboration between business and academia. So one of the things that has often been talked about is the importance of getting more research and development from our largest firms. Large firms don't just enjoy monopoly power, that is the ability to charge excessively high prices and produce too little on the product side. They can also exert what's called monopsony power, the ability to dictate terms to workers, to pay workers less than they're worth because workers can't simply go down the street and get a better deal. So I think that too has contributed to Australia's overly stagnant economy. We have this almost perfect storm of factors that I was worrying about last year. We had an unemployment rate which was 1 percentage point higher than in comparable countries. Britain, the United States, New Zealand, Germany, all had unemployment rates of 4 or even 3%. Australian was stuck stubbornly around 5%. We didn't have productivity growth. And when the OECD did a study where they broke down productivity across our big firms, they found quite a troubling pattern. They looked at our leader firms, that is the top 5% most productive Australian firms, and they said that they were falling off the OECD's productivity frontier. Best in Australia was falling away from best in Germany, best in America, best in Britain. And then they said for the bottom 95% productivity of Australian firms, they were essentially stagnant. That productivity among 95% of Australian firms hadn't improved since Sydney hosted the Olympics in the year 2000. So that really suggests that Australia has an ongoing productivity problem that we need to tackle. What might be causing this? Well, being a former professor, you won't be surprised to know that I think education's got a bit to do with it. When the OECD came to Australia to do its PISA tests, which it's been doing since the year 2000, every time they came back to us, they found the same thing. Australian test scores had fallen, and they'd fallen not just in maths, but also in reading and science. By the time they had been testing Australian high school students for a decade, they'd seen a full year's drop in school performance. In other words, Australian Year 9 students today score at about the level of Australian Year 8 students back in the year 2000. So our schools are, in economic jargon, less productive, and that naturally flows through to how people perform in the labour market. We've also seen a stagnation of education. The government has put back on caps on university places, which I think is a mistake in an increasingly automated economy. There's a lovely book by Larry Katz and Claudia Golden where they talk about inequality as being a race between education and technology. They point out that, speaking of technology, the automatic lights in my room have just gone off, so I'm going to wave my arm and turn them back on. There we go. Okay. Gotta love technology. Claudia Golden and Larry Katz talk about inequality as a race between education and technology. And they say that when technology outpaces education, then the gap between rich and poor widens. And so you've got to ensure that you're increasing the levels of human capital as technology advances. I don't think we've been doing that well enough in Australia. I mentioned before the challenges of research and development within Australian firms, which I think may go to the quality of management. And I think we need to ensure that we have managers in Australia who are as good as we're ensuring we get as other countries are getting. That's partly to do with training, but partly also due to a tolerance for taking risk among firms and their shareholders. I also think that we need to be ensuring that we have a sufficient diversity of industries in Australia. There's a thing called the Harvard Atlas of Economic Complexity, which asks the question, what's the export mix of a given country, and to what extent do they have all their eggs in the same basket? Australia ranks very badly on this. We rank around the same level of Morocco and Senegal, not countries that we would typically compare ourselves with. The things we do tend to be things that fairly simple economies do. It's not just a mining sector issue, it's also more broadly in manufacturing. We don't seem to be producing those elaborately transformed manufactures. In the service sector, we don't seem to be engaged in the sort of complex services exports that you would expect for a country of our income levels. That Harvard finding is a problem because the researchers there have shown that the complexity of an economy is a good predictor of how it's going to perform over the course of the coming decades. So our overly simple economy might well strike trouble. So in the remaining 10 minutes, let me say a little bit about where we are now in this unusual COVID crisis. Normally, when an economy strikes a recession or a depression, it's a crisis of confidence. Firms are unwilling to invest, consumers are unwilling to buy. But this is an unusual one. In the coronavirus crisis, the economy has been shut down because we know it's going to save lives. There's been careful economic analysis, including for Australia, that has shown, to my mind, very convincingly, that a short, sharp shutdown will save lives and ultimately will allow our economy to perform better when we reopen. But that's had massive economic costs. We had numbers coming out from the Australian Bureau of Statistics this week suggesting that since Australia had our 100th case of coronavirus, we have seen a 7% fall in jobs and an 8% fall in wages. The drop in employment has been largest in the accommodation, cafes and restaurants sector, where fully 1 in 3 jobs have been lost. Disproportionately, the job losses have been concentrated among women. We've seen when we do household surveys, 1 in 3 households report that they've taken a financial hit. The government's response package has also been different from what you'd put in place in a typical downturn. Typically, the recession response from governments takes 2 parts. Cash payments, because you can do them quickly, and infrastructure investment, because it has a large multiplier. In the case of cash, we know that some will be saved, and so the impact on the economy of putting out $1 of cash is going to be somewhere equal to or less than $1. In the case of building things, typically we expect that will be spent again and again in the economy, and so multipliers range from anywhere between 1.3 to 2. And so the normal recession response is some mix of direct cash handouts and infrastructure spending. And that's what Australia did in the global financial crisis. It's one of the reasons we're almost unique in the world in coming through that crisis without a recession. But here, people are social distancing. We don't want Australia to be rushing to the shops. So the household payments are designed to keep people afloat rather than encourage a spend-a-thon, rather than get people down to the local shopping centre. And the next part of the package is very much focused on keeping the connection between workers and firms. We want to keep this connection because once it's broken, it takes a long time to rebuild. Once a firm goes bankrupt, though the resources that it had can be deployed again, the management teams and the physical capital can be used again, but it takes a darn long time. Firms don't easily become uninsolvent. And the same is true of workers who lose their jobs. You can think of the economy as being, if you like, one large matching problem in which, like when you're doing a puzzle, and lots of us have been doing a lot of puzzles lately, we are looking at how to find the best fit between employees and employers. That's not an easy problem to solve. People often don't know which firm they're going to be best at until they give it a go. It's only through a process of trial and error that we find a job that gives us meaning and fulfilment, co-workers we like, a set of tasks that we find that we're good at. And so we want, to the greatest extent possible, to ensure that we don't break those employment relationships, just as we want to make sure that we don't send the firms to the wall. Because once we break them, it's just going to take time to fix them again. That's why, as they say, unemployment rates tend to go up in the lift and come down in the stairs. Once unemployment rises, it takes much longer to get it back down. We want to minimise the impact of that in the current downturn. And so these JobKeeper payments, which are a wage subsidy, a flat $750 a week paid to firms on the condition that they keep on employees, has been a really important measure. They weren't part of the first two stimulus packages announced by the government. We in the opposition jumped up and down a bit, pointed to many countries in the rest of the world that were putting in place wage subsidies, and then were very pleased when the government moved towards them. They're expensive, but not as expensive as having employment relationships fall apart and firms fall over. I don't see any reason why employees should lose their jobs, why firms should go to the wall because of an unexpected virus, which has led the government to say we need to shut down a whole range of industries. So I hope we're able to find our way through, but I think there's going to be some big challenges for Australia. Just to name a couple of those challenges, I expect we're going to see lower levels of risk-taking in the economy after coronavirus passes. There is some unproductive risk-taking, such as when people in the finance sector take unnecessarily risky bets. But a lot of risk-taking can be pretty productive. Entrepreneurs having a go, even when they know that the majority of their counterparts have failed. We saw after the Great Depression a sustained fall in the risk appetite of those who were prime age during that episode. A lovely paper by Ulrike Malmendier documents this. And I'm worried that we might face much the same as we come out of the downturn. I'm worried too that there might be an increase in inequality. We've seen already a number of ways in which this crisis could exacerbate inequality, from the fact that homeschooling tends to work better for affluent, highly educated households than lower educated households. The fact that low-income Australians are being encouraged to take $20,000 out of their superannuation. The fact that many of the jobs that are being lost are among lower skilled workers. I'm worried that in the course of then needing to pay back the debt, that the government will turn to cutting the sorts of social supports and investments in education that benefit the most vulnerable. That would be a double whammy for low-income Australians. And I'm worried more broadly that Australia will turn our back on globalisation. I spoke earlier about the benefits that migration has brought Australia, but the same is true of trade and foreign investment. As a country that contains just 0.3% of the world's population, we benefit from being able to specialise in the things we do best and buy other things from the world. We've benefited from foreign investment. I think of Japanese investment in our beef sector, American investment in our automotive sector, and our manufacturing sector more broadly. And recently, we've benefited from Chinese investment in a whole swath of the economy. This increases jobs, increases wages, and boosts productivity. So I do think that there's going to be a fight between the globalists and the nativists in Australia over the coming months and years, and that's going to be one of the challenges for Australia's economic prosperity. Jan, you asked me to speak for half an hour, so that's half an hour right there, and look forward very much now to questions from you and your students.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I mean, this has been a fascinating 30-minute journey into the Australian economy, both kind of longer term picture as well as more short term characterization. So that was really interesting, lots of interesting points. So let me open up the discussion. If I may invite students to always unmute and ask questions. Thanks, David. You can go ahead first, and then Lachlan.
Thanks for the talk, Andrew. I just had one question. You touched on why our productivity has stagnated, mainly due to educational purposes. And it makes sense if we are falling behind in specifically STEM and reading fields. But you also said earlier that our education's been increasing with our average years of school increasing and more people going to university, and then also having a high population of immigrants coming in who are already university educated, or conversely coming in for university purposes and staying on temporary visas past that. So how do the two intersect, or is one just sort of offsetting the negative effects of the other one? And so it's not quite as devastating as what it could be without the increased tertiary education?
Yeah, great question. In broad terms, we've seen an increase in the quantity of education and a fall in the quality of education.
Yeah.
So if you test kids at a given grade level in Australia, they underperform their counterparts from previous decades. But because the typical Australian has more years of schooling, if you test adults, then you tend to find that adult literacy, for example, is higher now than it was a generation ago. Adults will do better on straightforward maths problems. We've certainly managed to import a lot of highly educated people, and we've done that in part through the way in which our universities have taken in a large number of overseas students, many of whom have then ended up staying. And that's a form of temporary migration that I think has been highly beneficial to Australia, not just benefiting the tertiary sector through full fee paying students, but also allowing those workers to come to Australia on a kind of try before you buy basis, which people might work during university breaks at a firm, discover they like it, and then stay on already with a strong employment relationship, which you don't get when someone touches foot in Australia for the first time as a permanent migrant. We need to be careful with temporary migration, make sure migrants aren't exploited, and make sure that they're not crowding out the local labour market in a way that turns popular opinion against migration. But I think certainly that form of high educated migration has been beneficial to Australia. And just to close on this point, it's quite interesting to contrast migration in Australia and the US. We've tended to import higher skilled workers who provide services to the rest of the community and drive down higher skilled wages. So think of the typical many Australian skilled migrants as being importing doctors who then serve middle and lower income families and improve the access of those families to healthcare. Conversely, in the US, they've tended to import childcare workers and gardeners who drive down the wages of those low skill fields and whose services are mostly purchased by higher skilled workers. So you can see both on the production and consumption side how Australian migration might tend to narrow inequality a little. US migration has tended to widen it a little.
Okay, wonderful. Do we have another question? There's one in the comments.
Yeah, I have a question. I don't know how much you'd be willing to answer this question, but given your emphasis on the success of migrants in Australia, I wonder what your stance was on Christine Kennelly's protectionist stance on reducing temporary migratory inflows, and if you agree with her statement, we must make sure that Australians get a fair go and a first go at jobs.
Yeah, so I mean, Christina's been talking a lot about temporary migration, and I think it's probably worthwhile, if you're concerned about the issue, to go back to her piece in the Sun Herald on Sunday, because some of the subtlety of the arguments there hasn't been reflected in the way in which it's been reported since. She's concerned in particular about the exploitation of temporary migrants, and some of this in the area of working holiday makers has just been shocking. We've wanted to encourage migrants to go to rural areas, but in the process we haven't been careful enough to ensure that they're not exploited when they do it. So unlike the Pacific Seasonal Worker Scheme, in which employers have to sign up and there is appropriate monitoring of how those groups of employees are treated, working holiday makers simply get an extra year on their visa if they go bush, and often find themselves underpaid, living in terrible accommodation, and in some cases being sexually exploited. This is no way to be treating young people who are coming to Australia for a gap year, and we need to do that far better. I think there's also reasonable concerns about the way in which the temporary skilled migration system might not always be filling vacancies. The list of occupations is extremely broad, and I think probably broader than you'd want in a time in which our unemployment rate is going towards 10%. One of the geniuses of the Australian migration system has been, over the course of the past generation, as unemployment has gone up, we've dialed back migration. And that's meant that popular support for migration has stayed strong, even as the economy has gotten weaker. The price that we charge for these temporary skilled worker visas is, in my view, probably too low. If you're only paying $1,000 or so off a $50,000 or $100,000 worker, you've got to wonder whether we're really capturing the benefits that worker is bringing, as distinct from potentially creating a temptation for employers to bring in workers who are less likely to push back on pay and conditions. So I think there's a reasonable conversation to be had around getting temporary migration right. And the other point Christina's been making is the go slow on permanent migration. There's huge backlogs in the permanent migration system, as anyone would know if they've been trying to get access to a spouse or a grandparent visa, or have family members who are doing so. And there's been a slowdown in the granting of citizenship, which is just bonkers. If somebody has been living in Australia, they're a permanent migrant, then clearly there's no security threat there. If there was a security threat, they shouldn't be in Australia in any case. They want to pledge loyalty to Australia, to be part of our political system and to be part of our society. We should be rushing at them with a big bear hug. Instead, we're crossing our arms and saying you're going to have to wait a couple of years. And so that makes no sense either. So I think that's part of this temporary permanent migration conversation that we're having.
Lovely, thank you.
Great,
Are there any other questions? There's one Nat post in the chat. Nat, do you want to ask some of your questions?
Oh, Sovereign Wealth Fund.
Yeah. What do you think about that?
Do you want me to read it, Nat, or do you want me?
Yeah. Feel free. Yeah, feel free to answer those. Yes, thank you.
So Sovereign Wealth Fund, of course, relies on having an excess of tax revenue over expenditure, and sadly, we don't think that we don't appear to be in that situation at the moment, and I don't see us getting there anytime soon. So, in order to establish an additional fund right now, you would essentially be saying, well, we're running a budget deficit. We're going to run an even bigger budget deficit in order to put more money aside in the rainy day fund. I don't think many people would support that right now. But the question as to whether in the first decade of the 21st century we should have been running a sovereign wealth fund, yeah, absolutely. The structural budget deficits in that period, which were celebrated at the time as razor-thin surpluses, weren't the right decision given where commodity prices were. It would have made more sense to be saving some of that money and putting it aside. Norway's $1 trillion fund is enormously important for them as they look to a future in which the oil will eventually run out. And I think that's been very important in terms of allowing long-term decision making. The Chilean approach of having a fund which is used to stabilise the economy, I think, is also one that has a lot to recommend it. Excuse me while I just wave at my automatic lighting again. And the final question from that was about extending JobKeeper to casuals. Yeah, absolutely. Casual workers, as Melbourne University's Jeff Borland has shown, have demographic characteristics that look pretty, those who are excluded have pretty similar demographic characteristics to those who are included. The arbitrary cutoff of saying you've got to be with your boss for a year or more in order to get JobKeeper is just that. It's absolutely arbitrary. And hasn't, it means that a whole lot of Australians are unemployed who wouldn't need to be otherwise. And it has these sort of perverse consequences. So, for example, if you're a casual teacher, you've been a casual teacher for 5 years, but you've only been with your current school for 11 months, you don't get JobKeeper because you don't qualify under the 1-year test. That, again, makes very little sense to me.
Okay, there's another question by Dulshani. What do you think the assistance the government has provided to international students should they have done more on that front? Yes,
they certainly should have. I'm really shocked in politics, to be honest. I've been in the game for a decade. I'm pretty hard to shock. But I was rather shocked by the PM's if you're not happy, go home approach to international students. It's, first of all, try getting a flight home at the moment. Secondly, we have something of a sort of national duty of care for people who come here to study in Australia at the time of COVID-19. I don't think it's reasonable for us as a nation to say, hey, you should have come to Australia with enough spare money in your bank account to take account of the fact that just after you got here, the Australian government would announce a major shutdown of the economy. You'd immediately lose your job at the local restaurant, and you'd be doing all your classes remotely, perhaps with additional costs associated with that. That's not a reasonable approach to take. I was an international student in the United States for 4 years. And I would have been pretty shocked if the US had basically told me, mate, if coronavirus has hit, if you don't like getting nothing, then bugger off back to Australia. I would have expected to be part of the US response to COVID-19. And so too, we could be a whole lot more generous to international students in word and in deed. To their credit, many of the universities are stepping up, but they've had a huge hit to revenue, and they themselves have been unfairly excluded from the JobKeeper package. So they're really struggling right now.
Okay, we've got 2 more questions in the chat. So one is on the diversification of the industry that you talked about and what can be done about it on the policy front.
So let me...
it's one by Jessica.
Yeah, so Jessica, I think diversifying your industries is tricky from a government standpoint. Governments don't have a great track record of picking winners, and we have tended from time to time to back industries that have turned out not to produce the positive spillovers for the economy that we expected. But there is a role potentially in looking at regions where firms are clustering together, where there might be positive spillovers from agglomeration, and where it might make sense, for example, for governments to engage in rezoning or appropriate business parks and cluster policies that encourage firms to get those benefits of co-location. We know that for all the talk about a world in which distance doesn't matter, in fact, it turns out that proximity is really important. We want to think also about industry, about parts of Australia where there's surplus skills and where new industries might be encouraged to set up. So University of Wollongong has been doing a lot with 3D printing and innovation in their entrepreneurial lab, taking advantage of the fact that the closure of the steel industry there has meant they've got a lot of surplus skilled manufacturing workers. That's also true in Melbourne and Adelaide, where car plants have shuttered and where the skills of the workforce do suggest that governments could get significant gains from investing. But you're right, it's a tricky one to nail. Perhaps it's industry policy, perhaps it's competition policy, an area where I think we ought to be a whole lot more encouraging of startups and discouraging of large monopolies getting larger.
Okay,
let me flip to, there was another question in the chat, Jan.
Yes, Daniel. Imbalance between taxation between the federal level and the states, given that the state is performing more than the vital duties. What's your view on that?
Well, I mean, I think the GST was a move towards that, providing a strong revenue stream for states. The thing from a taxation perspective, Daniel, is that states not only have the most inefficient, economically burdensome taxes, they tax insurance, which is a terrible thing to do. Particularly given that uninsured people tend to then fall back on the taxpayer for support when a disaster strikes. The last thing you want to be doing is taxing insurance. And the second last thing you want to be doing is taxing mobility. So stamp duties are effectively a tax on mobility. They're economically inefficient because they stop people from moving to a home that's close to their work, and so therefore they increase commuting times. And they stop people right-sizing. That is, stamp duties mean that you have too many situations in which empty nesters rattle around in 4-bedroom homes while young families strain at the seams in small apartments. Those families might well have a beneficial trade to take place of exchanging their homes, but they don't do it because of stamp duty. So states have those inefficient taxes, but they also have the most efficient taxes. They have land taxes, which the federal government hasn't levied in more than half a century. So the shift from stamp duty and insurance taxes to land taxes is the tax reform in Australia that would have the most benefit in terms of economic efficiency. So I don't feel bad for the states. I recognise this is a political challenge, but it's being tackled here in the ACT, where Andrew Barr has been shifting the ACT tax base away from taxing young workers when they move towards taxing through rates/land tax, which we know to be much less economically burdensome.
Okay, I'll take the advantage of asking question, and that's
sure.
Because you talked about inequality, and it's one of your big topics. And we had in the subject last year, we had Stephen King talking about one of the reports, the Productivity Commission, on the topic of inequality. And he also mentioned that you kind of disagreed with some of the optimistic conclusions of the report. So would you like to give us a bit of a summary of your, I mean, you talked in relation to COVID-19, but just a bigger picture of inequality in Australia, the trends and what could be done to reduce it?
Yeah, sure. So big picture, inequality in Australia on pretty much any metric you pick has increased since about 1980. That's true of income inequality, earnings inequality, wealth inequality, and consumption inequality. The increase in earnings inequality, for example, means that since the mid-1970s, wage growth has been 3 times as fast for the top decile of workers as for the bottom decile of workers. The top 1% share has doubled, the top 0.1% share of income has tripled. And we now have a situation where the top fifth of Australians have about 2/3 of all wealth, the bottom fifth have less than 1% of the wealth. The Productivity Commission, though, looked at these trends and said, well, if you look in an international context, other countries have seen a rise in inequality too. America's seen a rise in inequality, Canada, New Zealand, Britain. And so we ought to be sanguine about that. I'm not sure I buy this one, right? I mean, if I look at those countries right now, I see a whole bunch of countries that have COVID-19. I'm not sure that means we shouldn't worry about COVID-19. The fact that other advanced countries have a problem doesn't tell you that Australia doesn't have that problem. They were also too sanguine, in my view, about intergenerational mobility, which in Australia is considerably lower than it is in countries of Northern Europe. That is that what your parents do and what your parents earn exerts a more powerful force on where young Australians end up than it does in Scandinavia. That goes against the notion that we often have that Australia ought to be a place where anyone can make it, where Jack's not just as good as his master, but maybe better, and in which we believe that being born on the wrong side of the tracks shouldn't be a barrier to where you end up. Again, we're not as bad as America, but no one else is either. So the fact that we're outperforming America on social mobility doesn't tell us that it isn't a significant concern. And I think that would have merited a little more focus in the Productivity Commission's report.
Okay, thank you. Are there any more questions now from the floor? There's a couple more in the chat. One of them is about the Australian housing market, about potential rezoning, and the Labor Party had some good ideas of what to do. Some of the reforms, but unfortunately didn't work out last year.
There's still a lot of stuff about reducing the capital gains tax discount and scrapping negative gearing. I do a podcast called The Good Life, Andrew, Leigh in Conversation, and I was speaking with Malcolm Turnbull on that podcast. The episode will be out tomorrow about his new book. He admits that his government was actively considering those changes, and so I think they're issues that where the politics is standing in the way. But certainly Scott Morrison has in the past been a strong advocate of reform. But there's also the question of zoning, which is the one that Ned asks. And that's something that I know the Harvard economist Ed Glaser has focused on a lot. Ed argues that one of the ways of getting around the NIMBY system and to move it from NIMBY to YIMBY, yes, in my backyard, is for the federal government to set up a fund which is available to local councils that put more units out on the market than they had in the past. So a reward for rezoning medium density housing that would help those local councils deal with the political economy problem. They could effectively say, look, folks, we know you don't love medium density housing, but the federal government will fund a brand new swimming pool if we put more of it in. So let's take from the fund and get the swimming pool.
Okay, there was another question about from Daniel, why do you think Australia is less entrepreneurial than other countries? One of the phenomena you talked about.
So Daniel, one of the suggestions that's sometimes made is this is risk appetite. You see this a little in the surveys. There seems to be some evidence that Australians are more deterred by fear of failure from starting a business than Americans, certainly than Israelis, but also than Brits. There may also be a question of access to capital and to know-how. There's a fascinating study out of the US which finds that entrepreneurs are much more prevalent in high-income households where there may not just be more resources, that is, you can borrow from the bank of mum and dad, but also a notion that it's okay to try something and fail because there's like a family safety net around you. We need to do more to match up potential Einsteins and Curies who live in disadvantaged neighbourhoods with mentors, and some of these mentoring programs that are being done with kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, to me, have enormous promise. And what I love about them, I guess it goes back to the book that Jan mentioned before that I wrote with Joshua Gans, Innovation Plus Equality, linking up potential entrepreneurs in disadvantaged neighbourhoods with mentors isn't just good for innovation and productivity and growth, it's also good for reducing the level of inequality and moving up the bottom to where it ought to be.
Okay, are there any other questions?
There's a question on Virgin I'm happy to take, but otherwise if there's someone who wants to ask one.
Yeah, that was my question actually. I was wondering whether you support it personally. I know the ALP did and former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd did. And if yes, how you go about sort of supporting Virgin in a fair and efficient way.
Yeah, I do support it. A couple of my mates, Richard Holden and John Asker, had a terrific piece in the Sydney Morning Herald about a fortnight ago, which I'd encourage you to read on this topic, because they're two of the very few people who are in the debate who don't have stakes in the outcome. I'm not sure you can believe what either Virgin or Qantas says about this, but you can certainly buy their analysis, which is that the $1.4 billion that Virgin was asking for works out to $23 per ticket for last year. So take total number of flights in Australia, divide 1.4 billion by that, and you get $23 a ticket. Now they say, given that the typical ticket is about $160, this means that you only need to get a fairly small price rise before that starts to look like a bargain. They suggest that if you move from a duopoly to a monopoly, then it's pretty likely that you will see price rises that exceed the 15% or so that investment recommends. And of course, that's conservative in two ways. First of all, it assumes that we're giving the money to Virgin rather than loaning the money to Virgin with an equity stake as was proposed. And secondly, it's only a one-year analysis. So if the benefits of maintaining a duopoly rather than monopoly continue, then you get those lower fares on an ongoing basis. But it's bad for productivity in Australia if we move to a monopoly. Textbook monopolies serve fewer airports and charge higher prices. That means not only that families don't get to enjoy the holidays they would otherwise have had, but it also makes it more difficult for businesses to do their work because airline travel's an input for many firms in the economy. So yes, I think it would have made a lot of sense for them to step in. I don't know where things are going to end up now.
Okay, I'm afraid you have to go now. Otherwise, I still have a question about education because this is.
I'm happy to take your final question if you like, Jan. I would never turn down your question.
So you talked about the quality of the performance of Australian students being kind of declining over time, and I recall in our 2012 interview, you kind of linked it to the declining quality of Australian teachers, and you had a lot of statistics on that. But that was 8 years ago. I would like to take your view on what's happened since. And I remember you linked it to the declining pay of Australian teachers in relative terms compared to other occupations. So what's been happening on that front? And do you think it's still a major issue?
I do. There's been some work by the Grattan Institute, which has found that the academic aptitude of new teachers in Australia has continued to fall. Going on from the trends that Chris Ryan and I documented. The concern that I have is that teaching hasn't been made as attractive as it needs to be in an environment in which there's many alternative options for talented young people. Not to say there's not a whole lot of brilliant teachers out there and brilliant would-be teachers studying right now. But we need more of them. We need to do more to attract them. We need to recognise that teaching isn't just another profession. It's the profession that creates all other professions. And that if we're if we continue to move in this direction, we could end up where the US is, where the typical American teacher now scores below the 50th percentile. That is, he or she was on average in the bottom half of his or her school class. I don't think that's where you want to be drawing your teachers from. I think teaching is too important. But as with all these things, it's about getting the incentives right. Jan, thanks for your questions. Thanks to all of your students. Economics is a fabulous discipline. I'd encourage you to not only finish your economic studies, but also look at opportunities to work in the sector and tell your friends about economics. Don't be shy about being a bit of an economics proselytizer, because one of the troubling trends over the course of the last couple of decades has been the decline in the number of people studying economics. And I think in part it's because they don't recognise what a terrifically powerful, interesting and fun discipline it can be. They're not out there listening to The Undercover Economist and Freakonomics and The Indicator and your work as well, Jan, all of which is really a reminder of what a fabulous toolkit this is for understanding the world and making it better.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. I mean, on behalf of all the students here, I'd like to thank you for a really interesting chat, and more broadly on behalf of the Australian community, I'd like to thank you for a major contribution, an ongoing contribution to the Australian kind of economics profession and public policy over the past 2 decades. So we wish you all the best. Best of luck with everything, and we look forward to reading more of your research and op-eds and reading your speeches, and hopefully one day we might see you as leading Australia as the Prime Minister. So
I don't think that's going to happen, but I'm very easy to find at andrewleigh.com and active on the podcasts and the blogs and Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and my monthly email and so on. So if you want to get in touch, drop me a line.